everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our third New Earth Conversation Trio, and I think as most of you know by now, the general idea is that we get three colleagues who come from very disciplinary and content area expertise places, and they sit together and just sort of kick around some ideas of what are the things they're thinking about climate change, what kinds of questions are they grappling with, do they find compelling. And then at the end of that conversation, we try to sift through and figure out what would be some interesting conversations for them to think about a little bit more, reflect on as individuals, and then share their comments with all of us. So we will follow our usual format. I will introduce the questions. They can introduce themselves, although I think we all know who everyone is. And we'll give each of them, and no one told you that we're starting to my immediate left, so you can go first when we're ready.
Just suck all the oxygen out of the room, it's fine. That's good.
So they'll each speak for 3 to 5 minutes. We'll give them a moment to respond to the things that they heard each other saying that were interesting, and then we'll open it up and see where the conversation goes. So our lunch conversation was all about politics. And we settled on 3 questions, and I know that they're not all going to speak to every question, but these were the sort of parameters of the kinds of things we were thinking about. So question number 1, in addition to the ethical imperative to engage meaningfully with climate change, how can we imagine our political engagement with it as individuals and as a community? Second question, what are the political possibilities at present? How do we use the political systems we have to get to the best possible outcomes? And then 3, what changes can we possibly affect in the current political discourse on climate change? So we'll let Ed take the first whack, and then you can pass the baton, and we'll see where this goes.
Okay. So maybe to preface this, I always take these kinds of opportunities to sort of provoke conversation, so take this in the spirit of provocation then. And the second thing is, and a number of you have been around me enough times to hear me say this, so I'm going to say it again though. I label myself a hopelessly realistic optimist all the time, and that certainly I think applies to how we think about these issues of climate and climate change. If we use the awful metaphors that seem to dominate our society these days, right? You go to war with the army you have, or you play the game with the team you have, or whatever that is. To some extent, I realize that I kind of operate that way, and I think that as a result makes me think about when I think about the politics of this is how important it is to understand the existing rules of the processes in which we're engaged when we think about climate change. And how important it is to understand the incentives of those who are engaged and participate in those processes if we're going to do anything political. And what that kind of means is I have to admit I get impatient a lot when people tether meaningful action a little bit too closely to what they might perceive to be a perfect world. And maybe I'm reacting in advance to Naomi Klein. And I recognize that. That's a long wait to do stuff, because the perfect world isn't here and it might be a long way away. At the same time, if you're tethering your meaningful action to this perfect world that actually hasn't arrived yet, it could result in actions or politics that don't actually engage the things that could be changed, that they don't actually do much of anything at all. I think perfect world thinking is actually important because it helps us think about the realm of possibility. We have to have that as part of a conversation. I just get nervous about how tightly linked things are. And maybe the reason for that is, and now this is where the post-structuralist in me starts wrestling with something that resembles the Marxist in me. Dick will appreciate that, although I'm a terrible Marxist, so there you go. Is that, he's grinning already, good, I got Dick on my side. I have Dick, for the next minute I've got Dick, and then I'm going to lose him again, that's okay. I'm going to go with that. Because, right, how we think about the policy, if you're tethering the politics of climate change to some kind of perfect world, to some kind of ideal political, economic, whatever sphere, right? you probably are making trade-offs with what happens in the now if you're going to wait for things to get better, or you're going to demand other kinds of things change at the same time. So for example, if you're going to do that, what you're implicitly suggesting is that things that are happening right now have to be sacrificed to that larger perfect world or perfect vision. That's a very political thing, and it's typically quite implicit, and it makes me nervous that it's not more clearly voiced. Or really the issue of who gets sacrificed. You know, whose suffering is okay to endure for an extra couple of years or decades while we figure out what the perfect way to address this might be. Ours usually not, but other distant others typically seem to be okay. And who's deciding who gets to be sacrificed or what an acceptable sacrifice is? Those things for me are all stuff that lurk a lot when I think about how to address this and how pragmatic one should be versus how idealistic one should be. On the other hand, though, okay, and this is, I'll leave you with sort of a last kind of thought here. And I phrased this at our lunch, so these guys won't have heard this before. I also then ask myself on the other side is, what am I willing to accept to get a solution to the climate change issue? There are many issues, but to address this particular issue, right? I can perfectly envision the creation of some giant carbon-sucking machine and some means of sequestering all that carbon. And I can actually envision a world in which markets might get us that thing, because if you look at what we're doing right now, if you look at the measurements, right, we're about 6 to 12 gigatons out of alignment with what we need to have in terms of carbon in the atmosphere to get to some kind of stable, reasonably safe future. The discussion of setting up carbon markets that has circulated for some time, back when they had anything that resembled a functioning one, could get to around $20 a ton for carbon. Do your math. It's 120 to 240 billion dollars worth of carbon flying around the atmosphere if those markets hold. You could spend $100 billion on figuring out the technology and still take home $20 billion. This strikes me as something I could see a market imperative for this kind of thing. But is that okay? Let's just say that comes about. Someone says, hell, I can make $20 billion. Let's go all in. Let's invest on this. And they invent the giant carbon-sucking machine, and it actually works. And then we're left with the exact same socioeconomic system that's gotten us all kinds of other inequalities. But at least climate change isn't our problem anymore. Are we willing to accept that kind of an outcome to solve this problem, even though it leaves all those other things intact? At the same time, do we have to fix all those other things and fix climate change? Or do we have to wait on fixing climate change to fix all those other things, in which case we're probably foreclosing a lot of things for people in the now? So that's all this, so I'm provoking, I think, with that kind of stuff. But that's what I'm worried about right now.
Well, Ed touched on Marx. I'm going to begin a little bit with Aristotle.
You got a one up me, didn't you?
Well, no, I'm just trying to keep up. Just trying to keep up. Aristotle said that politics was the master science, by which he didn't mean that politics could overrule the laws of gravity or other laws of nature, but that if you controlled the politics, if you controlled the laws in a polis, in a society, you could determine what got studied, what got built, how people made their livings, all the things that go into a society can get controlled by the people who win out in the political system and have the power in the political system. And my disciplinary background is this combination of politics and public policy and law. So I tend to approach a lot of these issues from that perspective. And it was kind of convenient for me that that's what we arrived at lunch, because I wouldn't have had much to say. But my starting point for thinking about the politics of climate change is that it's going to either need a political solution, or it's going to need the kind of technical solution that Ed alluded to in terms of the giant carbon-sucking machine, or being able to get to all renewable energy very quickly, or something like that. And I'm somewhat pessimistic about the possibilities in the near to intermediate term of a political solution. I mean, funny that anybody who watches the news is probably, pessimistic about political solutions in the short to intermediate term on many things. But this is, in the absence of a technological solution or set of solutions, we're going to need political ones. And this is fundamentally, in public policy economics terms, a collective action problem. We can't solve climate change by all of us deciding that we're going to drive a Prius and that we're going to recycle more stuff and that we're going to turn the lights off. It's not the way this is going to work. We need authoritative collective decision-making about energy, about carbon, about what gets emitted into the atmosphere, things that will significantly affect the way people live and the way economies run. And technology will play some role in this, but the political power of states, as reflected in laws and regulations and the implementation and enforcement of laws and regulations, is how we're going to get there. We're not going to get there from individual behavior change, because my perfect solution is that all of you stop all of that driving and all of that using lights. I'm going to keep doing it because my contribution to the whole problem is really infinitesimal. I could do nothing but hop on 747s and stay in 5-star hotels and play on golf courses in Dubai that they've created out of desert. I could do that as long as you guys didn't do that. I don't think that's going to happen. So we do need to have the political element of the solution, where we come together and we make laws and rules that bind us and penalize us if we don't go along with them. Picking up on something Ed said, which I had also thought about saying early on here, this is a huge problem for the world, and for me, I think it would be a good couple of decades' work if we solved this one. I don't think this changes everything. I think what this needs to change is we need to do something about climate. There are a lot of other injustices, there are a lot of other problems, there are horrible problems. But saying, oh boy, this is an opportunity to deal with injustice and poverty and racism, well, good luck to you. Good luck trying to solve all of these simultaneously, because that requires the politics to solve them simultaneously. So I just don't think we're going to go there. I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to give you a preview of coming attractions, because one of the things that I want to get into a little bit later on is talking about Clark and students and young people with regard to the politics of climate change.
Okay. So when we kind of thought about the political question as the question that all three of us wanted to engage with, we were thinking of the questions that previous trios had asked, which kind of were engaging with the politics, the ethics, and the science of climate change. Thinking politically, I'm kind of, because of my identity as Indian, I guess I'm thinking of the world at large, but also my own location here in the US, and that gives rise to a certain kind of political imagination. And so I was thinking about three kind of broad areas that really need attention when we think about climate change. One is the US. One, because of the power that it exerts, its historical role in this whole discourse around climate change, and the prevalence of climate change denial in this country more than in others. And it's important that it's in this country because the country has so much power at all international fora. It's the decision-making ability of the US is extremely important. And so what people in the US, or the political will behind kind of doing something about climate change in the US, is paramount for the rest of the world. And so it's not about exceptionalism as much as just we need the US to be on board with this, otherwise nothing's going to happen. And the next realm I was thinking of were China, India, Brazil, which are the three other countries, the kind of the developing world that all the discussions at Paris are around the increasing CO2 emissions in India and China. And so if we're in the same spirit of pragmatism, how do we think about this instead of just saying, oh, this is kind of a neo-colonial kind of putting a blame game on kind of China and India. Instead, if we think actively about alternative models of development, and that would also have to require the US interacting with these countries, because all three, India, China, Brazil, and the US, are imbricated in this neoliberal kind of system of global capital. So what India and China are doing towards development is directly related to what the US's economic relations with those two countries is. And the third part of the world that I really think of as important for a discussion on climate change are the small island nations that are directly impacted by the increasing CO2 levels. And so it's kind of a very varying scale of power in the US, developing countries, emerging developing countries, and then the countries that are likely to be annihilated. So the discourse takes very different forms when you think about these kind of three locations across the world and what the politics might be of thinking of these three together rather than thinking of each separately. And I think it's our kind of political responsibility as individuals and as communities to think of all three together, of all three as interrelated, very closely interrelated, and not just think, like Ed was saying at our lunch, the US food security is kind of so strong that it really, you don't have to think about food security for the next 50 years. But if we go with that approach, you might have climate refugees, quote unquote, arriving at your shores, and we know what the current political discourse on immigrants and refugees is. So combined with climate change denial, this kind of the response to refugees makes for a very frightening vision of what the future could look like. I was looking up even just the Wikipedia page on climate change denial, and it's very much US focused. $120 million anonymously donated to organizations that undermine the kind of public perception of the science on climate change. So I think, again, in the spirit of pragmatism, what we can do as educators is fight that through our own kind of pedagogical, the opposite of the undermining, to kind of push the agenda of climate change in our classes. And for those who work with policymakers, kind of lobby for it. Right? There isn't enough political will to do that. And just as a response to what both Ed and Jim were talking about climate change as the primacy of it in the political realm, for me, that's a little problematic because I feel like we have to imbricate it within other discourses that are extremely pressing right now, like questions of race, gender, class, Black Lives Matter, for example, something that has immediacy for a lot of people, and we can't just say we can push all that aside because climate change is going to impact us. If the next 10 years of my life are deeply impacted by something else that is very much part of the political discourse right now, I'm not thinking about drought 50 years from now and whether I can feed myself, etc. Right? So I feel like those, and the question of class, education, perceptions of the science around climate change, or the ethical questions. Some of the ethical questions around climate change strike me as extremely elitist in their concern for the world. There is a particular way in which we talk about concerns for the future that may not apply to a lot of the marginalized peoples of the world right now, who cannot imagine those futures in any case. So all of those things are political at the same time. And how do we think about all of them simultaneously rather than compartmentalize and say, let's solve one problem and then we'll address the next problem. Not that I'm suggesting we were trying to do that at all. Yeah.
So let's give the panel a moment to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up.
So I think I'm struck, Usha, by what you're saying, because I agree with you almost completely. I think my thought is, when we think about the politics of this, right, we have to ask ourselves what in fact are the questions, what in fact is at stake in these politics, right? And that's where I start getting nervous, is exactly the things you've raised, right? what are we trying to achieve? Should this be the primary thing we're talking about? To Jim's point, is it possible to solve this and 1, 2, 10 other things simultaneously? Is it possible to solve this without addressing 10 other things? These are all, I think, really valid questions, and they don't tend, it is my experience that they aren't necessarily framed that way. That very often we talk about climate change issues until you're in a climate negotiation, which is the only time it feels like politics become really clear in a global kind of sense. There's almost no discussion of that. It's just, it's the old crisis narrative justifies a whole lot of other things discussion. Something bad's gonna happen, we have to do something about this. You know, we can focus in on this one thing, and then you get to a climate negotiation, and one side says, well, you know, we really want to work out all the economic and other kinds of injustice issues, and Tuvalu says, and we're drowning. And you can work out your issues, but we're going to go away if you do that. So you foreclosed our future and our present and our future in your debate. Where's our ability to discuss this? And so I think that what your point was very much where mine is this is a incredibly complex politics. So actually, I'd kind of be interested to hear Jim talk about how one goes at that, disentangles that, if you can, right? And how effective that might be.
I want to be clear. Politics goes on, and it's a realm where everybody, depending on their interests and their power, contends and gets what they can, and does that across the whole range of issues. That's not going to stop. What I wanted to caution about was the idea that solving the when we focus on climate change, we can also say, oh, let's solve this in a way that also deals with the horrible injustice of, North America and Western and Northern Europe being so rich, and much of the world being so poor. Okay? No, because that's a really hard problem too on its own, and it complicates the politics of dealing with the problem of climate change. I mean, and so I'm against the idea that we're going to use climate change as an opportunity to fix 6 big things simultaneously, and what a wonderful thing that would be. I have I have negative confidence in that. But do I think that everybody will still be working on Black Lives Matter and public transportation and gun control and choice on abortion? You bet. We're all going to. That stuff is all going to go on in politics. One of the things that I brought up when we had that nice lunch together, thank you, Clark, was that if you look at American politics and you say which interests, which groups are the strongest in our politics, who has the most clout in Washington on legislation and regulations and so forth, it's a pretty short list of groups that you say, wow, they're really powerful. And I would start with the National Rifle Association. I mean, there's a group that gets its way a lot of the time. AARP, which I guess no longer calls itself the American Association of Retired People. They like the sound of ARP better. But AARP is pretty powerful. Don't screw around with existing benefits for Social Security and Medicare. I mean, there's a few like this, but it's a very small number. And what they have in common is that they don't give a damn where a member of Congress is or a candidate is on other issues. You're in favor of gun control, AARP doesn't care. You're against gun control, they don't care. They just want to know where you are on their issues. NRA, same thing. They will give you money if you're pro-choice or anti-choice. They just want you to be, voting the right way on what they call Second Amendment issues. We've got nothing like that on climate change. There are groups like 350.org that focus just on climate change, but they have nothing compared to the clout, no clout compared to these other groups. And I think it's worth thinking about whether we need to have some powerful junkyard dog kind of advocacy group that says, we don't care where you are on income inequality. We don't care where you are on choice. We don't care where you are on prayer in the schools. None of that stuff. Just where are you on, reducing carbon emissions, a carbon tax, a cap and trade. We got our issues, you better be with us on this, because if you're not, we're coming to get you. And if you are with us, we're gonna make big political contributions to you. And I guess just to continue that thought, a thought experiment for all of us, you know, as a voter, as a citizen. You know, is there an issue that you're prepared to be that kind of single issue voter on? I mean, because most of us care about 20, 50, 100 things, and, you know, we hope that we can find political leaders and candidates who agree with us on all of them or almost all of them. As the parties have divided, there's actually a lot of alignment among the people that I end up supporting who are pro-choice and pro-gun control and pro-doing something about climate and so forth. But it's not perfect, and you end up losing the focus that the powerful groups in our politics have when you start wanting to have a portfolio of issues that you agree with your candidates on, rather than being the hedgehog who says, no, just that one issue, and you better be with me on that one, because it happens to be the fate of the planet.
Just responding to the imbrication of all of these things together, I was thinking about microfinance in Bangladesh, which has been discussed a lot in development circles in the last few decades. And so there are now structures of microfinancing where microfinance only goes to women in rural Bangladesh, because there are ways in which women hold on to money. It's better for family, it's better for the children, etc., if the money goes to the women and not to the men of the households. There are ways in which we can think of development, gender, race, and they're also encouraging them to bring back ancient varieties of rice that do not denude this very dangerously kind of located part of the world in terms of climate change. So there is a way we can hold all of these things simultaneously in our heads rather than think of themselves as unitary obsessions that we need to push for. I absolutely agree politically, we do need a very strong climate change lobby. But given how ideologically and politically it's kind of unraveled in the US for the last few decades, it seems pretty clear that if you are, I don't even want to call them pro-life, if you're anti-choice, you are very likely also a climate change denier, because there is a certain ideological structuring that leads to those things, pro-gun, pro-gun, anti-choice. All of these form part of an ideological kind of structure in which climate change is not allowed, because it doesn't allow a certain vision of equity and of the future for everyone together. So I feel like it's pretty clear who are going to be our advocates in this country for climate change. The Republicans are not suddenly going to change their mind about climate change, it's very clear, or about immigration, which I think is so kind of closely related. And so maybe if we were talking about what can we do, right, as individuals and communities, that's what we need to push for, probably, to give greater visibility to climate change, but also even within campus, we were talking about why we don't get, how we might improve turnouts at the climate change events. And it might be to suggest to a lot of the other groups who are discussing race, affordability of education, etc., that this is centrally part of those discussions as well. And all of us need to meet together to discuss about those things, because there's so much we could gain from those discussions as well. Everyone could gain from all of those discussions.
All right, Ed has signaled he wants to get one thing in, and then we'll make this a conversation with everybody in the room. Go ahead, Ed.
No, because this just got bound up. So I was really, Jim did raise this at lunch, and I was really taken with his sort of question, which is, you know, could you vote for the candidate that is just dead on climate change, but is just diametrically opposed to you on some or multiple other issues? And I really thought about that, because for those of you who don't know my background as well, right, I just moved here from South Carolina. Never complained about Massachusetts politics, okay? Never. I have nothing to say to you people, okay? When you guys argue about, like, public transportation, you're arguing about how much, not if, okay? But South Carolina is actually home to some really interesting exceptions to some extent. While I agree there's a large alignment, there's actually a lot of fissures in there that just haven't been made clear. So I'll give you an example. For those of you who remember Mark Sanford, or as I like to call him, Governor Appalachian Trail, he then managed to get himself elected back to Congress. I don't know how. During the last year or two, I was in South Carolina. His politics are aberrant, to me, in most ways, except for one thing. He actually deeply cares about the environment and conservation. Why? He's a hunter. And a lot of hunting groups care a lot about the environment, actually care about climate change. They're very worried about species distributions, and they're worried about the wise and responsible use of natural resources. They don't go out and shoot everything that moves. They know you only shoot a certain amount a year because otherwise you deplete the resource. And so, like, Mark Sanford, folks, is your candidate. He's so far to the right of everything else, he's basically untouchable from the Republican Party's perspective. He is, like, I'm sure he's scoring beautifully on NRA and other scorecards, but he actually could be persuaded to think about, maybe don't call it climate change, maybe just say to him, hey man, you're about to lose that marine estuary, you're gonna lose that particular beach that's a beautiful, and he would get upset about that and actually say, no, that shouldn't happen. How we're pitching, but that all that said, thank God I didn't have to choose on this. He was in a different district. Could I have voted for him? I don't know. The person running against him was actually Stephen Colbert's sister, right? Who actually was trying to run as much as a Republican as a Democrat possibly can, and actually on the environment thing was not lined up. So if I was a one-issue voter, I'm actually looking at Mark Sanford as my candidate?
Yuck.
This is a really great question for us to kind of wrestle with here, and that's why I take everything that Jim's saying so very seriously. Just the way our politics actually works, this puts us in some real difficult places. I just want to pull that together.
Would someone like to get us started, and then maybe we'll just move? We're so small, we could just do a tour and see who wants to pipe in. Yes, Dick, get us started.
I'd like to talk to you about the relationship between utopian and practical political thinking. Utopian thinking doesn't dream of a better world and thinks that suddenly, from some kind of revolutionary action, it's going to pop out of, massive demonstrations, et cetera, et cetera. The function of utopian thinking is to guide practical politics. Okay? In other words, you're engaged in often conflicting things like you just said, but your overall objective has to get to a world which you think is going to be far better than the miserable thing that we have at the present time. Now, it's interesting that when you got to talking about utopian things, you chose a carbon-sucking machine. So your version of utopianism is technological utopianism. Now, first of all, that machine doesn't exist.
That's right.
That machine may never exist, but if your utopian thing is technological, all your political thought is going to go in that direction. This is not a thing that's going to, is going to have a technological solution. Look, climate change is a result of an entire mode of life. That mode of life is sick and needs to be changed fundamentally. And you need to change the climate part of it as part of a massive change in the way we live our lives and treat each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we need a general politics. We don't need a specific little interest group. That's absolute bullshit, in my opinion. We need a massive movement, that has a number of components and that goes about changing the world dramatically. And you say, where is it? So show me then. Well, Bernie, he's the first person, isn't he? The first person in 50 years. The first person, I tell you what, when I vote for him, it'll be the first time I ever voted for somebody I believe in. Oh no, when I was in Australia, I voted for the Unemployed Workers' Party. But here's a person who is for structural change. It is possible. What Bernie needs to do is have a really good environmental component to his campaign that is linked into the component of inequality, and links the two because they're obviously very connected with each other. So what I'm saying is we do need utopian thinking, but I don't agree that it's technological.
Dick, if I could just jump in. It seems to me significant that Bernie's the first time in 50 years that you've had an opportunity to vote for that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that goes to the difficulty
Yeah.
of the strategy you're implicitly putting forward, I mean, explicitly putting forward.
Yeah.
If American politics only coughs up a Bernie Sanders once every several decades, and there's a good chance he won't get the Democratic nomination, and there's a good chance he wouldn't win in November if he did,
Yeah.
that suggests that the strategy of what we really need to do is to smash capitalism and have a society that's organized on much more communitarian principles, and so that I think that's, I mean, I'd bet less heavily on that happening in the U.S. in the next couple of decades, even with all the anger that's being expressed in both of our parties right now, than I would on either the politics changing because a bunch of people get together and create an AARP or NRA on climate, or because the company that Ed has invested heavily in for the carbon sucking machine actually, produces that machine. I'm glad I don't have to bet the rent on any of those three things, frankly, but I think it's a long shot.
Yeah, but Bernie didn't pop out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Bernie is a response to the escalation of fundamental contradictions in global and especially American society. He's not just a person, who's foresighted, although he is. And the fact that large numbers of people support him shows that increasing numbers, especially of young people, which would be a good idea to get to, you mentioned you want to talk about it, a large number of young people now in this university especially are into a fundamental analysis of the basic nature, especially of American capitalism, and he is the product of that wave. So it's not that it's just him this time, but he won't be again. There'll be a number of Bernies.
I don't want to monopolize, but I do want to just say that at the same time, we had a candidate arise who's talking about keeping Muslims out of the country, Mexicans being rapists and murderers.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a lot of support for that
Yeah,
too
there
in
is,
the country. And I don't think that those people, most of them, are going to become enlightened about their class interests and actually become supporters of the kind of fundamental change you're talking about.
No.
All right, I'm fascinating and
This is why
productive.
our department meetings are so cool.
Right?
I have just figured out how to fix that. Anita, you're tasked with that.
I see Diana wanting to get in. Do we want to actually try to move in a circle, or should we just go to Diana? I guess it depends on Tony. Are you ready with the next intervention?
Okay, well, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble, not least Dick.
Oh, I'm getting
But I
more
sort of
wine.
feel.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a long ride.
Me too.
But my other,
We can hear you from over there though, Tony, so go ahead, doesn't matter.
and the other side was going to be, having just seen the university's financial model, I'm not sure I'm worried.
Yeah, 6%, baby.
Good luck.
So the preface to this, and this is what Dick has to hear.
All right, Dick, are you listening? Tony's speaking directly to you.
No,
I'll shout to the
I have to have red wine to survive 10
What do we need? Do we need a wine opener?
it's the other side of faculty meetings.
I have it, sir. What do we need?
We don't know if we have it.
We
We don't want to break in the momentum here, though.
I'm
We're
sorry.
gonna be ready.
I'm
We're ready.
sorry.
We're
I'm
ready.
sorry. Don't move. You got it? Okay.
You got
All
it.
right.
Toma is paid well to fix these problems.
Okay, Tony, we're ready.
So the preface to this is that it's a very long time since I've been to church. But as I was listening to this sort of, do we couple or don't we couple the climate question and the societal question, for whatever reason, I was thinking of the Beatitudes. And there's one Beatitude which is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So this is a terribly Anglo-Christian centered comment as well. And it seems to me that one of the spirits of that Beatitude is that it really matters who's going to inherit the earth. And for this particular discussion, the subsequent question that gives rise to is, if there are certain conditions of inheritance, should one bother about saving the earth? Or take it to a sort of a more local, this is just an abstract but a more local case. If there's a kind of wonderful historic building that is falling apart, but it's occupied by squatters who have nowhere else to live. But it is ultimately going to fall apart. If the building gets saved, it will get gentrified and will become the house of one wealthy family. Should one save that building? And so that's, I think, those questions are really important questions, and to uncouple the societal distributional question from the climate change question is risky, because it stops us from having to ask who will inherit this earth. So, sorry, it's my...
No, I completely agree.
Wait a second, write that
More
down.
religious mind.
I just heard Dick Pete say I completely agree.
Yeah.
That may
In
be the
terms of
first
who,
time.
yeah, who quote inherits the
But
earth. I
I-
don't like that phrase, but
But in truth, that really was what was going through my mind, the Beatitudes.
I was actually thinking of this today.
I'm not
Do you
gonna,
wanna chime in?
try and follow, no. The only thing I was thinking of is, when I was a little kid, we had the big Echo movement in the 1970s, where we just had those Echo flags everywhere, and we were all green, and we dressed green and go to school and talk about Echo issues, and we all had a
Echo meaning
consciousness.
ECO, not ECHO.
EC.
Yeah, Captain
Eco.
Planet.
Eco.
Dora the Explorer.
I know, it's big, and we had this, we caught the imagination of a whole group of really young people, got really active in it. I think we need to think about why that all fell apart, because it did, in a big way. We need to kind of understand why we lost consciousness, or all of a sudden it just fell off the map. And I worry, if the country regains a certain amount of economic comfort or something, then we'll face that once again, when people just kind of splurge and forget about the larger picture.
Anita, would you like in?
Well, I'm thinking about the difficulties of interglobal regulation, really. And I was really struck by some of the things that Usha was saying about these different levels of contribution and also potential suffering. So the idea of a coalition between these very unlikely bedfellows, right? And then and then I was listening to Jim talk about regulation and regulatory structures and how difficult that is when we think about the global picture. And I don't really have an answer, but I'm looking at how the world is trying to cope with forced migratory movements and thinking how terribly impossible it seems to get them together, to get these individual countries, and what's happening rather than opening up and thinking collectively is a closing down and fencing off. And but I do like the idea of coalitions that Usha was talking about. I think a coalition model is, I don't have much more to say about than that at the moment.
Well, India and China definitely have reasons for that, for wanting that coalition, and the US has reasons for it. It's the smaller islands that no one cares about. The kind of the unfortunate byproduct of our greed and avarice.
Okay. It gets more complicated the more I listen. That's what's supposed to happen. My first early question in response to both Ed and Jim, and particularly the way you phrased this, Jim, about the political power of states being needed and beyond individual action. But what to do with the political and economic power of corporations? And where is the countervailing power? And you remember, was it Time Magazine or Newsweek that had, the people in the street as the global superpower, the new global superpower, right? It was coming out of The Nation. One of the people that writes for The Nation coined that. And so I think we ignore at our peril, if we, people that can sit in this room, in these positions, we would ignore, and the U.S. as a country would ignore at our peril, the new global superpower, which is all the people who feel displaced, disenfranchised, disadvantaged, dissed in general, including Black Lives Matter. Okay. The other piece that that comes out to me is to think about, and I mentioned this at lunch today, so my apologies to those that were present for that, but to think about the fact that we need to have thinking, sensitive adult supervision of the economy, okay? We have to put that thing under some serious adult and ethical supervision, because it's part of society. And but we've got the economy, you know, as the tail wagging the dog of society and of the whole planet, and of who thinks they own the planet, and the idea that it could even be owned, but it is right now, under some frameworks, one of which we subscribe to here in our country. So my sense is that it doesn't mean, like Dick said, that you change it tomorrow, but that you're starting to think, this can't stand. And the other one that comes to me, so 2000, I'm in a cab, I'm talking to this guy, and he starts talking to me about money. And I said, you know, this election's really got me upset. I feel like Rip Van Winkle. I went to sleep in a country and I woke up in a bank. All anybody's talking about is money, and I thought a country was about taking care of each other, and was I really wrong about this? What happened here? And so I think there's that, but the other piece is also the assumption of growth, and what if not growth, and the necessity of growth in the current system is driving climate change, and how in the hell are you going to get degrowth without addressing that? So to me that is a technical problem, people. It is practical as all hell. How, and in 2008, I'm told to be patriotic and go shopping. And every time I listen to NPR, for God's sake, you know, the left wing and the radio waves, and they're always talking about, and oh my God, not enough people went Christmas shopping. I'm thinking, where's the voice of climate change here? It's like, yay! You know, use your old stuff, make somebody a nice recipe for Christmas, but to keep the economy going, we're all supposed to be going shopping. So we can't ignore the current economic system just in terms of the physics tied to runaway economics, not appropriately governed, of consumption. So that's my piece.
Well, I can build on
Okay, great. You can put a solar panel right on that.
that. Yeah. I blame it on hedge funds. I brought that up in every major meeting now. So, because what I see, I mean, what I really hear here is that politics and economics are critical in this, and I know actually very little about either. So, I think about this. What I was thinking about, the reason why the word hedge fund came to mind is that my study of economics began and ended with The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. That's really all I know, and this, you know, the story about the pin, and the idea that he uses it as a pin or a needle, actually, a pin that you know, as the pin is manufactured, there's someone adds value. Someone gets the ore, someone turns it into steel, someone makes it into a wire, someone puts a head on it, someone sells it. But at every step, there's value added to it, and that's necessary to find the final product. So the difficulty I see, which brings the economics and the politics together, is the politics is necessary to allow certain kinds of things to happen in economics. And I always see hedge funds, maybe partially because of the recent movie, whatever. I mean, they're something that is huge in our economy. It's billions of dollars, and they add no value to anything. And at least that's a liberal's view. And that might be certainly the Bernie Sanders view. Then we have carbon, which could be $1 billion industry, billions of dollar industry, but it's only billions of dollar industry if it's legislated. And a Republican or a conservative would say, you're legislating that, just as you're allowing hedge funds, it doesn't add any value to the economy if you don't believe in climate change, or you don't believe in man-made climate change. You're not adding any value. You're just creating a market artificially. So the only way you can do that, of course, is with the political will to do it. We're stuck. I mean, we're stuck because are you going to convince enough people to make a political decision to create a carbon market. And there's so many decisions like that that will have to be made, and what's real and what's political. And you need both the political and the economic solution to work together. It's so hard to do that.
But hedge funds are merely the most notorious aspect of the whole financial system. You know, the financial system runs on speculation. And
Right.
speculation is basically unproductive. In fact, it's destructive because it leads to great instabilities.
Right.
I'm working a little bit on it, and from what I can see, about 5% of investment is productive. Goes into R&D, goes into corporations, adding productive capacity, etc. And 95% is hedge funds, derivatives, and even far more,
Right.
esoterics, speculative ventures. And what we need is the several $1 trillion a year that goes into speculation and creates an unstable economy and also sucks demand out of the system so it's difficult to move it, and work with it. What we need is those trillions of dollars going into climate change, social change, etc. In other words, we need to take the money off the 1% and take it, I'm afraid, through the state, I think, not through markets, not through carbon markets, because all they want to do is make money off it too, all right? Goes through a democratic state and is deployed into technological devices, plus a number of other things, right? Hedge funds are just the worst, the most notorious, worst little fragment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the banking system. I just to add to that, I had a discussion with an old friend who's just retired as a CEO of a decent sized $100 million revenue company, something like that. And he said one of the things he learned, one of the most useless things, was the banking system for him. In a large company like that, you constantly need loans, and these banks give you loans, but they skim off a huge amount of money doing valuations and things like that. And he said it could easily be done by basically a government agency for a fraction of it. Companies need money all the time, and yet the whole loan business to for-profit companies is just
To get investment, you have to offer high, quick returns.
yeah.
But also just linguistically, it's ironic that it's called the futures market, right? Because considering that it's not for any kind of common vision of a future for everyone, that climate change would imply social change would imply.
Deb?
So I'm going to just respond to a couple of things just with little notes and then move into my topic. I'd like to report that apparently, based on the news reports, that Mark Lasry did very well in the owners basketball tournament. And the reason that I bring that up is that the Lasry Center, the Lasry buildings have been funded by a hedge fund investor. So it's just where are we at as an institution?
And actually, a lot of the great progress in our endowment
Yeah,
was
exactly.
because of the connection to.
So I just
Yeah.
I just want to say,
Absolutely.
but he's also, and in the paper, they talked about his basketball roots beginning here at Clark, so that's, the other is that Randy Olson is currently a filmmaker who's interested in science communication, who left a tenured position at the University of New Hampshire to go to film school and now do this. And he has a short video about where's our climate movement, and he goes back to some of the things that you mentioned, and I think touches a little bit on some of Jim's points, is that when you become diffuse, you lose focus, and he talks about some competing interests, and I haven't looked at it for a while, but I think makes the argument that by losing focus, you lose energy and direction, and it's fun. He's flippant, he's fun. I'm going to move to the carbon sucking machine because I feel comfortable there. I've been educated here tonight, but I'm moving into my comfort zone. And in that comfort zone, one of the books that we mentioned this weekend that I think is interesting to go back to, and it's John McPhee's Control of Nature. And it argues, it provides, and I want to say that was published probably the late 70s, early 80s. But he eloquently and humorously describes the many ways in which we as humans have failed to control nature. So the Mississippi River, Iceland, there's a lot of great examples there. And so I'm going to go now to the carbon sucking machine. And I think that there's a great example where the design of a carbon sucking machine came out of science, stimulated science, and told us that we weren't on the right track. And that has to do with the iron fertilization experiments of the ocean. So the original fertilization experiments were motivated by the science that there was an anomaly that was observed. People went to test it, and these were huge, large-scale experiments. And then around 2000, it came into the idea that could this be our carbon-sucking machine? There were companies, there were venture capitalists, there were money invested in sort of a holding pattern, and there was an international effort to try to figure out how we might govern this if this was the way to go. And it was really careful science that indicated that this wasn't the way to go. It was mathematically and ecologically impossible to meet our goals. And had we proceeded without caution, it would have potentially upset an ecosystem tremendously. And I think one thing to think about the ocean is that it's a great reservoir, but if it burps, we're in worse shape than you could ever imagine. And so I think that's the place, we were talking a little bit about it again at lunch today, it's like that's a point where stillness, if we think about stillness being, we need more information before we proceed, was critical in circumventing what actually, if it had progressed at the way that it was being talked about at the turn of the century, it would have been probably disastrous, but we don't know because luckily we didn't do those experiments.
I want to riff off that for a moment and come back to your point about the movement of the 70s. Because I think I disagree with you. Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring in '62. And in '69, the National Environmental Policy Act is passed, and in '70, the Clean Air Act is passed. And the '70s lead to a whole raft of legislation on air, water, hazardous waste sites in 1980 and 86. And what happened between the mid-60s and about 1990 is why the air in LA isn't like the air in Beijing. And there's a bunch of things like that you can point to in terms of a politically driven set of laws and regulations and their enforcement that business fought tooth and nail every step of the way. The CAFE standards for automobiles, the requirement of catalytic converters on automobiles. A huge amount of progress was made on what we thought of as conventional air and water pollution. And I mean, we still have outrages, obviously. There's still a way to go on that stuff. But we were kind of conducting an experiment as a world where in Eastern Europe and in Russia and now in China, they were trying to run a modern industrial society without modern environmental controls. We got those controls here as a result of a political process. The problem we face with climate change is much harder for lots of reasons, just the nature and the structure of the problem. But I don't feel like it kind of blossomed and went away. I think it blossomed, did a whole lot of good on relatively low-hanging fruit kinds of problems, but is not up to the challenge of dealing with this problem that has that has this dimension of, I mean, the pogo dimension, meeting the enemy and it's us. We like cheap gasoline, we like turning the lights on, we like the air conditioning, and each of us individually likes that. And are the ones who are going to suffer if we have to do behavior change or paying more for stuff.
Well, it's interesting you say this, because I was one of those school kids in LA in the 1970s when we had smog alerts and we
Yep.
couldn't go outside. So we were, what we call in Spanish, dolientes. We suffered the consequences of environmental pollution every day. And I think movements often, this happens to them, right? The movement gathers lots of recruits, there's a lot of mobilization, and then it passes to another scale in which lawyers or others take over and begin to legislate things, and the movement moves out of the hands of people.
Mhm.
And that happened in the 70s, or more in the 80s,
Yeah,
really, in
exactly.
Southern California, when we should have been able to make more structural changes about public transportation, a whole lot of other things, ocean, water quality off our beaches and the like. It just went, because it moved into a different realm in which common people, they couldn't talk law and regulation anymore. It wasn't their battle. It moved into a different sphere.
Yeah, but don't forget, the big business put a ton of money
Oh,
into
absolutely.
destroying that movement and in creating an alternative movement.
I mean, sure, there were lots of machinations going on. I don't deny it. But I just feel it's so hard around climate change to get, when I'm in Latin America and working with certain groups, it's very clear. They are threatened directly and they mobilize and they resist any sort of dispossession. But I think of my fellow citizens here, and it's just, we just can't find those points.
It's tough. I bring this up in my class all the time because I feel like my students aren't there, but it's so different. It was the smog in LA. London smelled like diesel fuel. The buildings in Rome were literally disintegrating before our eyes. The
That's
clam
really
beds and the clam beds, all the shellfish beds in Europe on Long Island were all closed. I mean, we just saw things falling apart, and I mean, everyone did, and people were losing their jobs over it. Climate change is so much more subtle, certainly for us, and I think that's a tricky part of it.
And we had villains. You could basically,
Oh, yeah.
there was this justice element to the fight for clean air and clean water in the 70s and 80s. It was corporate America. And it was very hard to maintain the position, we should still be able to put all that crap in your air and water. And that made the politics of our side stronger, and we were able to overcome some of it. You don't have that structure of the thought process around who the villains are of climate change. I mean, we all have our ideas of who the
Because
villains
we
are.
are.
Yeah.
But
We are
because
we
modern industrial
We are.
societies.
No.
But isn't there
I
a
am
way
not
to
sure.
take that structure, like you were saying, Denise, about constructing the villain, but also turning climate change in a way partly to the lawyers, the people who speak of Washington, and actually get this moving. The villains clearly, at least one villain definitely is the fossil fuel industry, and very much part of corporate America. There are so many other things we need to do, and definitely, I mean, the larger thing is, of course, social change, just in terms of how Americans think normal life should be. Why does every person need a car? And why does everyone need to drive to work? But those are going to be things that are going to be harder to change than just going at the fossil fuel industry the way they went at the tobacco industry, like we discussed in the Climate Change Council, or all the kind of wins in the 70s and the 80s.
You know, so we listen to all this. The first thing I want to do is declare victory, because I clearly provoked well enough for the carbon sucking machine to show up twice. So I'm feeling good. Especially because by no means is that my vision of Utopia Deck, I promise. In fact, it's probably the opposite. But, by the way, I completely agree with you. That is what utopian thinking should do. I think is guide practical action toward a goal. Sometimes I think that utopian thinking becomes too detached from that process.
Sure.
That's maybe my reaction mostly. So all that said, there's also, I think, it's an overweening concern I have that gets into the politics of this, right, is this is very academic of me, but hey, we're academics. Precision of language matters a lot. And how we talk about stuff and how we mobilize things. And so I'll give an example. I've heard the term, we're talking about speculation. There's no question that there's some extraordinarily problematic speculation that happens in the world, right? But that's not necessarily an inherent part of speculation. Let me give you another example. If you think about what speculation should do in its pure sense, which I acknowledge does not exist in the world, but in its pure sense, right? If you think about, say, in food markets, or really in any commodity market, it is pulling future shortage into the present. So when you think about climate change, right, speculation actually should be like a fantastic tool. It is pulling the future into now, assuming you have any kind of information about the future, right? Which is, if we know that 20 years from now there's not going to be any maize available anywhere, well, one would think that you could speculate on that lack of maize, which should pull those prices forward, create some sort of signal of information in the economy that causes us to become concerned about this, right? So I'm a little concerned when people get upset about speculation because it can be used, or at least watched, in ways that give us really useful information. It is how it is used and to what ends. And so I think that's one of the things that's kind of lurking for me when I think about all these politics and things, as well as we have to be careful about, this is where it all gets murky again. Who are your enemies? Who are your friends? What are the problems versus tools? Well, it turns out they might actually all be the same things at any given moment, depending on who's wielding them and to what end. So we're back into politics, right? I mean, so anyway, this is just what's circulating for me from all of this, is being careful about how we make these arguments. At the same time, by the way, fully acknowledging that sometimes, and I'm absolutely certain will back me up on this, that, and Dick would too, that careful often doesn't exactly fire people up and drive them into the streets, does it? Again, multiple tensions we have to negotiate, and I fully acknowledge that.
But most of the speculative devices had a practical origin. Futures, mortgage bundling, mortgage insurance, et cetera, they all started off exactly the way like 20, 30, 40 years ago. And what's happened since is the amount of money going to wealthy people has increased spectacularly, so that the functional purpose has been almost forgotten by comparison with the amount of money that just moves around doing totally speculative part.
Absolutely.
So in other words, it's exaggerated by wealth inequalities.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks,
Thanks, Diane.
Well, this actually reminds me of gambling, and think about what happens, somebody goes to the slot machines and they put a few dollars in and it doesn't seem to be a big deal. But then you think about the concentric circles of gambling addicts that get created around centers of gambling, and it's almost like that, so that the thing runs away with the budget for the family, the house, the food, the kids' schooling, the car, right? And I think that's what we have. You've got, that Wall Street has a serious gambling problem. And that's why I keep saying we need adult supervision, because this isn't working out well. Or it needs to go to the counselor, It needs a utopian vision. It needs something else that it's part of that is greater than its current game. And that's the piece I think you cannot decouple.
Hey, my dad was one of them. My dad was addicted to Greyhound, and we had no money. We had £5 a week, and he spent £2 of it on stupid dogs, until a dog dropped dead on the track. He said, "I'm never going to gamble on dogs again," and he never did. So he switched to horses. It is partly addictive, part of it is addiction, right?
Okay, I'm not sure I'll follow up on that, but I did want to give us one last volley, and and Jim, maybe we'll put you on the spot first. So as sort of the final round, given all of these tensions, single issue versus a utopian world that would bundle all these intersectional issues, mortgaging the now for the future, all of that. Do we have last thoughts? And we know that Jim has some because he alluded to them. is our role as educators at Clark in terms of preparing students to navigate all of these, extremely acute in the short term and long term political, ethical, moral challenges and dilemmas. So, Jim, take it away.
Before I talk about the students and the teaching part, I want to talk about just for 2 sentences about the research part.
Great.
Because, I mean, it's very frustrating, I think, for all of us to see climate denial and to see this, you can't even call it a debate, this talking past each other, not talking to each other in the halls of Congress and on television around climate issues. And it can make you throw up your hands, and yet for those of us who do scholarly work and advocacy work around these issues, I don't think there's anything to do other than to keep doing it and doing it better. Dutch Leonard, who's at the Kennedy School of Government, talks about the role of information and analysis and evidence in influencing policymaking. And what he says is, it doesn't get you the optimal solution. You might come up with analysis that says, here's the optimal solution. But what analysis and evidence and argument can do is at least put pressure on the really dumb ideas. At least try to rule some things out of bounds by saying, oh, that won't work, let me tell you why. And then it's sort of like, sports teams, some make the playoffs and some get weeded out. And once you have the ideas that haven't been weeded out, normal politics take over, and you don't reach an optimal solution, but at least we maybe have done our jobs by making it harder for really stupid, beastly things to happen. Turning to students and away from the sort of research and knowledge creation part. 2 observations. One is big changes take time, even if they're not as big as the changes that I hear you arguing for, Dick. I mean, changes like getting our air and water cleaner over the 60s, 70s, 80s. That took some time. The civil rights movement, which is not completed, but the going from the lunch counter sit-ins to the election of Obama, there's some amount of progress there. It takes time, and some of these movements, and civil rights in particular, had a big element of young people being the movers and the people in the streets and the people at the lunch counters and so forth. And obviously, the people who have a bigger stake in saving the planet, if we're to do that, are the people who are 20 today, not the people who are 50 or 60 or 70 today. So I think there's something there. But I couple that with a conversation I had earlier this week with a Clark student who was a political junkie and political activist who's really frustrated by the lack of political interest and activism that they're seeing among their colleagues. They see their colleagues as being feminist, progressive, multicultural, but not terribly involved in the political system. I sure don't see a lot of people around here among students who I see as real political activists and getting very involved in the electoral process or whatever. And I think that's something for us to think about, because in a university where so many of the students seem to have their head on straight about values and about changing the world and making a difference for each other, there's not a lot of them that I see expressing it through activity in the political process.
Are you responding in general?
Anyone can respond. Panel, I defer to the panel first. Panelists want to jump in. If you don't want to jump in, that's also fine.
For me, this is only my second semester at Clark, and I'm always trying to process what I take away from these climate change discussions to the classroom, and I teach film studies. During the council this weekend, I was wondering, is there any point to publishing my book and trying to get tenure? Who's going to care about a book on Indian cinema 30 years from now if we can barely live, if we can't imagine a future that extends that far? But I think it impacts every, including this discussion, impacts every film one chooses for one's syllabus. So if I'm teaching Godard's Maoist period from the late 60s, there is a reason to make them think about, and my students have a way. I was showing them Eisenstein's strike yesterday, and they said, oh, this is just propaganda. So to teach them the history of those words and how they are specifically located as American subjects is the only way I can engage with climate change. I don't know the science of climate change. I'm learning it as I hear about it from everyone here. So it's important just for all of us, I guess, to think about how we can take it back to the classroom in each of our disciplines, even if it's not directly related. But the question of globalization and capital and neoliberalism just cannot be ignored when we talk about climate change. It's not I find the scientific discourse just one aspect of it. And you cannot not think about the people when you think about this. Like Tony said, is there a future worth aspiring to if it's an unequal future?
Look, Clark students on the whole are liberal left students, and they are very concerned about social and environmental issues. Okay? You're right. There's not too much very direct political activity going on, and very few of them are involved in, say, any political organization. And the gap between the two, in my opinion, is they think there's nothing they can do about it.
Was that different here 25, 30 years ago?
No,
than
it was
50 years
better
ago?
than it was. There was a lot more direct political action here in the, equivalent to your period.
Well, even when I was there, I remember marching.
Yeah.
Even when I was
Yeah.
in the 80s.
And I think university campuses had a lot more political activity
Yeah.
in the 80s. And
What do you mean by political?
That they're members of a political organization that has an agenda, and they are dedicated to it, and they work for it. Very few students here do that. Although, and it's not lack of overall commitment to change. That's a too easy dismissal. It's just that I talk a lot to these kinds of students. They fill my classes, so I do it all day, every day, okay? They think there's nothing they can do about it. They're overwhelmed by exactly the point I was trying to make about this is a problem that comes out of the entire structure. They find that true, but overwhelming.
That's your fault.
My fault.
So yeah. Start to answer that with a story that probably speaks to my teaching style, right? Which then speaks to how I would use this educationally. And I'll tell a second story. So the first story is my father was brought up on the North Shore of Boston, brought up in, second, third, whatever generation Irish Catholic family, very Catholic, ended up going to Boston Latin, had right down that line of sort of, very straightforward Catholic education without a whole lot of questioning. And then he goes to Fairfield University for undergrad, and that was when they still required you to take a theology course. So he sits in his class, and it's 50 or 100 of the people, and it was all men at the time, right? So it's all sitting in a room, and the brother, whatever, gets up, and he writes the 12 Thomastic proofs on the board, and my dad goes, oh, God, not again, because, he's been doing this since he was 6 or whatever, he's seen the Thomastic proofs. He says, and then the brother proceeds over the next 50-odd minutes to disprove, in order, all the 12 Thomastic proofs. And at the end of the 12, he turns around, looks at the class, and goes, good, now we can start. My dad's response was, yeah! And most of the rest of the room was panicked. Right? So when I think about what you can do and talk about this kind of thing, climate change presents this opportunity to call into question an awful lot of the things that you think about how the world works. I used to do this all the time in my intro to human geography class in South Carolina. My former TAs will tell you my teaching style was, I will use the first week to break your understanding of the world over my knee, then we'll start. And that was sort of what I wanted to do, and I think that climate change sort of presents that opportunity. At the same time, I think it is such a complex question, which we've raised today. There's so many angles into it, and so many interconnections, that to teach a way, or even any number of ways I can possibly imagine to address this and think about it, as pathways, I get nervous about. Instead, I think we return to really what I think, I know everybody in the room now, we're into, it's critical thinking, skills, right? So the second story I was going to tell is, so my 9-year-old daughter came home, and for those of you, you've heard this Be Like Brit thing, you know what I'm talking about. A young woman was down on what I think was a mission trip in Haiti. Earthquake happened. She dies in the earthquake. And they've kind of started this movement of, it's effectively another way of sort of missionary, not really missionary, but donations to do good work in Haiti kind of thing. And apparently my St. Peter's Central Catholic, where my daughter goes to school, decided this was going to be their public service thing. And of course, you know, I'm a critical development guy, so immediately like I cringe as soon as I hear this, but I know Monsignor, but I can't go yell at Monsignor. So I'm like, all right. And then I'm talking to my daughter about it though, and I realize I just did exactly what I do in undergrad. It's terrifying. I did this to her. But I looked at her and I said, I said, you're understanding the world, let's do this. Because she said, you know, we're going to give money to the people in Haiti and they're going to build an orphanage. And I said, why do they need an orphanage?
Money for pagan babies.
Well, mercifully, there was not money for pagan babies. They're pretty progressive. They don't worry about the pagan part. But there was definitely money for babies. And I said, well, why do they have that? Well, there was an earthquake. Yeah. Why don't the Haitians have their own orphanage? They don't have any money. Why don't they have any money? I don't know. Maybe we should talk about the history of Haiti for a little while. And it was just sort of backing up to, I wasn't telling her where to go. I was just saying, have you asked a couple of questions before you hand $5 to this person? And then kind of saying, by the way, if they go build the orphanage, have they told you guys how that orphanage is still going to be running in 5 years? Well, no, they should build the orphanage. Who's going to make it run? I don't know. Maybe you should ask them. And it's the same tools with this. How did we get here? How do we get to this place where we're clearly overtaxing the Earth system? Why the hell are we in a place where somehow we can't talk intelligently about this? What are the things that we could think critically about? What are the things that grab you about all these connections that you feel like you could get purchase on and do something about? I feel like that's, to some extent, what we have to do, which means, by the way, absolutely it could be a film studies class. It could be any number of topics. It's whatever grabs and motivates somebody, and it gives them an angle into this thing. We can't ask everybody to be, we talked about, we can't ask everyone to be Chris Williams. That's not right. It doesn't work for most people. I'm terrible at math. I suck. I was really poor at calculus, and you don't want me to go beyond that. We need folks who do that, but we also need folks who do all kinds of other things. We need people to be able to represent in different ways, and this is where the arts become huge, what we're dealing with and thinking about, right? And so I think that's really what it comes down to, is how do we pull this thing apart, each of us, and present ways of taking that apart to people and letting them play with it. That's, to me, what we do.
Yeah, but there's a direct link between Haiti's 100 years of payments to the slave plantation
Absolutely.
owners in France and the need for orphanages now.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, my daughter suddenly cares about colonial history. She's 9. I'm just saying, when you start to unpack these things, I didn't tell her colonial history was important. She just wants to know why the hell they can't build their own friggin' orphanages. And this is a 9-year-old who's disturbed by this, and then all of a sudden it matters. If I try to tell her about colonial history in the Caribbean, do you seriously think she's going to listen to me for more
Yes.
like 90 seconds?
Yes.
I'm a good storyteller, Dick, don't worry. Absolutely not. But if I tell her, if I tie it to something like that, and she can see where it plays out in the present, all of a sudden a 9-year-old gets engaged on this, right? I mean, so anyway.
Now, I just want to jump in because.
Dangerous, you know my children, so I should-
No, I was involved back in the early 90s when I was in Catholic Relief Services. We were talking about the link between faith and environment and getting people to care about the environment. And it occurs to me, we could have some really interesting classes here. And one of them could be the end of the world, right? I mean, there are religions that are very much looking forward to the end of the world.
Disrupting
right?
myself, yeah.
Great conversation.
They are very politically active religions. And they have a lot that they don't want to see happen in terms of climate change, because this is God's hand.
Right.
And I think those kind of conversations with our students would be helpful. I mean, going back to, we're a liberal arts college. Ideas in the world matter. Faith matters. And maybe we need to teach some of these things, though I don't know who would do it, don't look at me. But I think helping students understand where this ferocity of belief comes from
Yeah.
might be helpful. I don't know, just from that experience, it made me see, there were certain groups of people who really do want to see the end of the world.
Thanks, everybody. Great conversation. Have a